You can call me Harris. It isn't the name on my passport, but it's the name I give to the moments when I am most honest with myself. Names, like melodies, only make sense when they're carried by breath. This story is inspired by true events. It's told with deep respect for all faiths and meant only to share one man's journey toward finding peace in Islam. From which country are you watching this video? Subscribe to this channel if you love Islam. I used to think certainty was a chord I'd mastered. On stage, beneath the hush that precedes a first note, I could summon a crowd's heartbeat with a flick of the wrist and a disciplined inhale. I believed in the predictable physics of sound. Pluck, vibrate, resonate. Truth, to me, was a fretboard, countable, reachable, mapped beneath calloused fingers. Back then, my days were scored by rehearsals and the metallic scent of strings pressed against my fingertips. I woke to a phone full of messages, each one a new arrangement or a subtle complaint. Too slow on the bridge, Horace. Or, can you give the chorus more ache? I knew how to deliver ache. It's a skill you learn when your calendar is filled with shows and your nights taper into mornings with neon buzzing like a swarm of cicadas outside the studio window. But certainty, like a bright stage light, has a way of blinding. I didn't notice the shadows growing at the edges. The applause that once rose around me like warm surf began to feel like a wave that wouldn't put me back on shore. Between songs, in that fragile corridor of silence, there was a hum I couldn't name. Not the hum of amplifiers, another kind. A question with nowhere to land. I tried to drown it in work. I layered tracks upon tracks. Guitar over synth, synth over strings, strings over a human voice, until the voice sounded less like confession and more like a sculpture I'd polished into lifeless perfection. I told myself meaning was technique, and technique was meaning. Perhaps that's true for a while. One evening, after a show, I walked alone along a street lacquered with the sheen of recent rain. The city's air tasted like dust cooled by water, a relief on the tongue. Somewhere, a bakery was closing. A warm smell of sugar and yeast drifted by on a closing door's sigh. My clothes still held the perfume of the crowd, that mingled scent of sweat and excitement and spilled beer. I remember thinking, if I could bottle the silence between footsteps right now, I would. Not the kind of silence that follows exhaustion, but the living kind, the kind that listens back. That was the first time I noticed it, the pull. A thread so thin, it could have been a trick of the mind, but I sensed it tugging at me from somewhere just beyond the obvious. I wished I had words for it. Musicians rarely admit how poor we are with words. We explain ourselves by sending sound into rooms and hoping someone else will name what we felt. I grew up with a different kind of certainty. My family taught me that goodness was visible in action and that belief is a private candle, steady and discreet. We prayed in our own way, with our own language and traditions, and I was sure, deeply sure, of the ground those rituals gave me. When I left home to chase stages and green rooms and the odd, tender magic of strangers singing your words back at you, I packed that candle and tucked it carefully between my spare strings and notebooks. Over time, I stopped taking it out. Questions began, like soft tapping on a window. Then they learned my schedule, waited at the end of every show, followed me home in the taxi's small lights skimming over my knuckles. "What do you want from the applause?" they asked. "What remains when it ends?" I answered with rehearsals. I answered with longer sets. I answered with the kind of collaborations that look like ladders you climb because you're afraid to look down. The turning wasn't dramatic. It came disguised as a simple thing, a morning off. I had been up late composing a piece that refused to settle into itself, a restless creature dodging every structure I offered. Sometime after dawn, I stopped giving it boundaries and gave it quiet instead. I set the guitar down. I opened the window. I listened. There was traffic, yes, and a neighbor's slow kettle beginning to sing, and the small domestic rhythms of people waking to their lives. But beneath all that, there was stillness, thin as a line of light creeping under a door. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe in time with it. Later that day, at a cafe whose walls were freckled with old gig posters, I met a friend I hadn't seen in years. He had always been grounded in a way I envied, gentle, precise, as if every word he uttered had been offered to him by a wiser silence just before he spoke. He ordered mint tea and asked about my music. We talked about tempo and touring and the odd ritual of airports. Then, without plan, I told him about the questions at the window. He listened the way a good audience listens, leaning in without grabbing. When I finished, he placed his palm flat on the table as if steadying something delicate. Sometimes, he said, the heart is searching for the one who made its rhythm. I felt defensive, the way a musician does when theory threatens to dissect a feeling. He didn't press. He only said, "If you ever want to sit with me for prayer, no concert, no conversation, just presence, come." We parted with an ease I didn't expect. As I walked home, the city's noise gathered and flung itself forward, as it always did. Yet it seemed to break around an unseen rock, and in the eddies there was room for quiet. That night, on my rug strewn with cables, I laid my guitar across my lap, and instead of tuning it, I tuned myself. I breathed until the breath slowed the thoughts it carried. I whispered the names I knew for the holy, the ones learned from my family's faith, and the ones I'd borrowed from poetry, and I asked simply that the questions would show me how to kneel. In the asking, tears arrived without permission or drama. They were not an audience, they were rain. A week later, I accepted my friend's invitation. We met at a small room above a bookshop. Not a mosque, at least not yet, but a place where a few of his friends gathered to pray and to read. Shoes lined the hallway like quiet boats. The floor smelled faintly of clean wool and old paper. Someone offered me water. It was cool enough that I felt it bless my mouth. When they began to pray, I stayed seated, listening. There was a cadence to the recitation that struck me first, not as performance, but as surrender. It folded around the bones of the afternoon and hushed the reckless animal in my chest. I didn't understand every word. I don't claim that. But understanding and being understood aren't the same, and what I sensed was the latter, the suspicion that a mercy older than my instruments knew how to hold a soul without interrogating it. After they finished, no one asked me to explain myself. We talked about ordinary things, bread, bus schedules, the weather's trickster ways. Someone laughed in a way that made me think of open windows. At home, the silence had changed. It no longer felt like absence. It felt like a listener waiting for me to speak plainly. I found myself waking before the sun, standing at the window, letting the pale edge of morning press against my forehead like a cool hand. I tried to pray, clumsy and shy. I said, "God, I don't know the right names or the right steps, but I am here. I am here." Music changed too. I began to write pieces that left space between notes, as if the silence itself were an instrument deserving a solo. I didn't know then that what I was imitating was the bowing of a heart, I only knew that the songs asked less of the audience and more of me. They asked for truth, and truth, when invited, comes with soft footsteps and rearranges the furniture of a life. One evening, the rain visited again, gentler this time, like a friend unwilling to leave the porch. I walked with no destination, my hands deep in my jacket, listening to the city wash itself. That's when I first heard the call to prayer. Not blasting, not asserting itself, just arriving, like a river, I had finally stepped close enough to hear. The voice threaded itself through the rain and through me, drawing me toward a small building set back from the street. I didn't go in. I stood beneath the eave, water beating along the edge, and I waited until the call stitched itself closed. I wish I could tell you I walked inside then and everything changed in an instant. I didn't. I'm a slow learner in matters of the heart. I went home and sat on the floor and held my guitar like a child being carried back to bed. I played nothing. I watched the last of the rain unravel across the window. But the call echoed, a gentle insistence that the heart's rhythm was not an accident, but an invitation. I started reading, not just about Islam, but about the lives of those who searched and surrendered in many traditions. I found a kinship in their humility, in the way great seekers speak softly when they approach the sacred. I didn't want to argue doctrines. I wanted to taste water. In those weeks, my certainty, once a rigid chord, loosened into a progression that made room for awe. When my friend finally asked if I wanted to visit the mosque with him, I said, "I'm afraid of being disrespectful." He smiled in that unhurried way of his. "Respect," he said, "is a door already half open." We chose a day. I washed my hands before leaving, the cool water waking my skin as though it were a tongue touching a true name. On the way there, I listened to the city's ordinary music bus breaks, bicycle bells, a toddler rehearsing a new word, and felt a quiet certainty gathering that was not of my making. I will tell you about the threshold, the feeling of it, the breath I took before crossing, the fragile bundle of hopes I carried like an instrument I didn't yet know how to play. But that belongs to the next part of this story. For now, know this. A musician who once believed sound was everything had begun to recognize the shape of a different grace, one that arranges silence into a form the heart can kneel inside. In the stillness of that recognition, my fingers lifted from the strings. I let the last note fade until it mingled with the quiet and was no longer separate from, I whispered, not to an audience, not to a stage, but to the one I had been circling without knowing. If you are there, teach me to listen. And the quiet answered not in words, but in a peace that steadied my bones and turned my steps toward the door I was finally ready to open. They say there's a moment before change when the world grows impossibly still, like the air takes a deep breath and waits for you to move. That's what it felt like as I stood at the threshold of the mosque. My friend's hand rested lightly on my shoulder. "Take your time," he said. The door ahead of me wasn't grand or gilded, just wood, softened by years of palms pressing against it, seeking entry, seeking peace. When I finally stepped inside, the air changed. It wasn't colder or warmer. It was honest. The kind of stillness that doesn't demand performance. My shoes were left behind, lined up among others, each pair a quiet story of someone's walk toward the same mystery. The carpet received me softly. I remember the faint smell of clean wool and sandalwood. There was no music, no applause, no stage lights, just a low, living hum of recitation coming from the prayer hall. It was the Quran. I didn't understand the words, but I felt them. like water tracing the shape of stones long before the mind names what it feels. My friend guided me with gestures more than words. "Follow my lead," he whispered. "Just move with us." So I did. My body hesitated, unsure of the rhythm, but something deeper, older, seemed to remember it. We stood, we bowed, we placed our foreheads to the ground. The first time my forehead touched the carpet, I didn't know it was called sujud. I only knew it felt like falling without fear. The floor held me as if it had been waiting. I had bowed on stages before, after encores, under blinding light, but this was different. This wasn't a gesture toward an audience. It was an unlearning of every performance I had ever given. It was silence teaching me its language. When the prayer ended, I sat there longer than I meant to. The men beside me exchanged quiet salams, then went about their day. No one asked me who I was or why I had come. The simplicity of it undid me. I looked at my friend. "I didn't understand anything," I admitted. He smiled gently. "You understood enough." We stayed after the congregation left. Sunlight filtered through patterned glass, breaking into dust motes that moved like notes suspended in air. My friend began to explain, slowly, patiently, the words I had heard. He spoke of Al-Fatiha, the opening chapter, how every prayer begins with gratitude. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful. He said it wasn't just recitation, it was conversation. A dialogue between a human being and their creator. I let that settle inside me like a chord I had never dared to play before. We went through each movement again, standing, bowing, prostrating. I watched his lips, the cadence of his words. He invited me to repeat after him, not perfectly, just sincerely. When I stumbled over the Arabic, he said, "God understands before you pronounce." Those words reached me in places no song ever had. Hours passed unnoticed. Between the recitation and explanation, there were long silences, natural, weightless. I realized prayer wasn't about filling silence. It was about being found inside it. I thought of all the times I had stood on a stage, commanding noise to prove I existed. Here, I needed only to breathe. Later, as we sat near the entrance, an old man approached. His beard was silver, his back slightly bent, but his presence steady, luminous, filled the space around him. He greeted my friend, then looked at me with eyes that seemed to know without, asking, "You are new," he said softly. His accent carried a music older than mine. "Yes," I managed. "I'm learning." He nodded, smiling. "Then you are already blessed. Learning is a kind of worship." He patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving the faint scent of musk behind him. Something broke open in me that afternoon, not with sound, but with surrender. I didn't suddenly have answers. I didn't understand every word or law. But the stillness I had been chasing through chords and compositions had finally found a name. It was peace, not the peace of things arranged perfectly, but the peace of finally letting go. When we left the mosque, the city had shifted. Or maybe I had. The same street that once screamed with noise now seemed wrapped in patience. Even the car horns sounded distant, like echoes from a life already fading behind me. That night, I tried to pray on my own. My friend had shown me how. To wash wudu, he called it. The water was cold, startling at first, but it woke something in me each time it touched skin. Washing wasn't just cleansing, it was remembering. In my small apartment, I spread a folded towel on the floor in place of a prayer mat. I whispered the words, I half knew, half felt. My pronunciation stumbled, my posture trembled, but when my forehead touched the towel, the silence returned faithful, familiar, alive. I stayed there long after the prayer ended, forehead pressed to the ground, whispering questions I didn't yet have language for. God, is this how you've been waiting? All this time while I filled the air with noise? There was no thunderous reply. Only the smallest peace, rising in my chest like dawn creeping through a half-drawn curtain. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The air was blue and trembling with quiet. I heard the adhan again, the call to prayer, this time from my window, drifting over the rooftops. My heart moved before my body did. I washed, I stood, I bowed, and though I didn't yet call myself Muslim, something inside me already had. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to protect the silence growing within me. I was afraid that explaining it would shatter its purity. So I carried it quietly between chords, between breaths, between heartbeats. That week, every melody I wrote sounded like an echo of the Quran's rhythm. My guitar, once a tool of pride, became a mirror for longing. I'd play a single note, let it fade, and hear in the fading, not loss, but return. Each night, I prayed again. Each time, the Arabic grew a little clearer, the motions a little more certain. I was no longer performing. I was remembering something the soul had always known, that to kneel is not to surrender defeat, it is to meet mercy. One evening, my friend called. "How are the prayers going?" I laughed softly. "They're clumsy, but peaceful," he said. "Then they're perfect." And I realized maybe perfection was never the point. Maybe honesty was. As days turned to weeks, I began visiting the mosque alone. The same doorway, the same soft carpet, the same peace, waiting without conditions. I still didn't know if I was ready to take the final step to declare faith aloud, but I knew I was walking towards something real. Each prayer stitched me closer to a truth that no applause could buy. The same hands that once chased music now trembled with gratitude. The same voice that once sang for crowds now whispered in solitude, "You are one, and I am yours." And though the world outside still called me Harris, the musician, inside I was becoming something else. Not someone new, but someone finally awake. I didn't yet know that the day would soon come when I'd speak the words that would change everything. But that moment, the doorway of faith was already opening wider, and through it, silence waited, smiling. I used to think the most powerful moment in music was the crescendo, that point when every instrument converges, when the air vibrates so completely that silence becomes impossible. But I was wrong. The most powerful moment is the pause before it, the breath when everything waits. That's where I was living now, in the pause. Weeks had passed since that first prayer. The city was still the same, but I moved through it differently, softer, slower, like a man trying not to wake a sleeping child inside his chest. I prayed at dawn, when the world was still blue and tender, and I whispered thanks before sleep. Peace had become a familiar visitor. Yet beneath that peace, there was a quiet trembling. It wasn't doubt, it was yearning. Something inside me knew this silence was calling me forward, asking for a word to seal, a word that would make the inward surrender visible to the world. But the weight of that step scared me. I still played music alone, behind closed doors, but each time I did, I noticed the songs had changed. They no longer tried to impress. They sounded like prayer, disguised as melody. I would finish a piece and sit there in the afterglow, feeling tears warm my palms. One night, I called my friend. I didn't know how to phrase what I felt, so I just said, "I think my heart already believes, but my tongue is waiting for permission." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "When the heart knows, it's the tongue that becomes shy. Let's go to the mosque tomorrow. No pressure, just come." The next day, I woke early. The sky was silver, the streets washed in soft light. As I walked, my breath fogged in the cold, and each exhale felt like a confession I hadn't yet spoken. My palms were sweating, my heart beat, a rhythm I couldn't write down. At the mosque, the same wooden door waited, unassuming, patient. I ran my fingers along its grain and thought of every door I had opened, chasing applause, chasing purpose. This one was different. This one didn't promise success. It promised surrender. Inside, the imam was there, a calm man, with lines of wisdom drawn softly around his eyes. He greeted me with a warmth that didn't need translation. My friend introduced us, then stepped back, giving me space to breathe. The imam asked gently, "Tell me, brother, why are you here today?" I swallowed hard. My throat felt like it was holding years of noise. I've been listening for a long time," I said, "and I think I finally know who it was I was hearing." He smiled, nodding slowly. "You already carry faith in your heart," he said. "All that's left is to let it rise to your tongue." Then he explained the Shahada, the testimony of faith, how it is simple but carries all the weight of truth. Ashhadu alla ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger. I repeated the words softly at first, then again, with trembling clarity. Each syllable felt like shedding a lifetime of armor. The words weren't foreign, they were home. When I finished, silence filled the room. Not the kind of silence that waits to be broken, but the kind that holds you. The imam's eyes glistened. My friend's face broke into a smile so gentle, it undid me completely. I couldn't stop the tears. For the first time, they weren't tears of exhaustion. They were tears of arrival. Someone brought me a glass of water. I held it like a sacred thing. The first sip tasted different, like every cell in my body was saying, "Alhamdulillah." All praise is due to God. The imam placed a hand on my shoulder. "You have been Muslim in your heart for a long time," he said. "Today, you just let the world know." After prayer, the men came to greet me, strangers, yet not strangers. They embraced me like a brother who had been gone a long time. There was no judgment, no interrogation, only joy. Simple, unadorned, holy joy. When the call to prayer echoed again, I prayed as a Muslim for the first time. The rhythm was familiar, now the bowing, the surrender, the rising. But something had changed. This time, I wasn't imitating, I was answering. My forehead touched the ground, and I whispered inside my chest, "This is what I was made for." Every melody I had ever played felt like it had been reaching for this single note. This still, eternal sound of surrender. When I left the mosque that day, the city shone as if rinsed by light. Even the noise had rhythm. The wind carried the call to prayer through alleyways, and I realized this world was never silent. I just hadn't been listening right. I walked home slowly, my shoes tapping a quiet rhythm on the pavement. For once, I didn't plan to record it. I just wanted to live it. That night, I stood by the window again, watching the stars rise over the city. I whispered, "Ya Allah, thank you for finding me in the noise." The wind answered softly through the glass, as if saying, "Welcome home." In the quiet, I thought of the boy who once believed music was his only language. He had been searching for silence all along, not the silence of absence, but the silence that holds the divine. And now, I had found it. Or maybe, it had found me. The journey didn't end there. In many ways, it had just begun. Faith, I learned, isn't the closing of a song, it's the first note of a melody that never ends. But for tonight, I let the stillness have me. And in that stillness, I prayed my first true prayer of gratitude. Alhamdulillah. They told me that after the Shahada, life would feel new, but they didn't say it would also feel heavier, not like a burden, but like holding something sacred with trembling hands. Each breath felt deliberate, each step witnessed. For the first time, I felt seen not by people, but by the one who had been seeing me all along. That awareness changed everything. Even my reflection in the mirror seemed quieter, like it knew now that its purpose was not to be admired, but to be grateful. The days that followed were soft and strange. I was learning how to pray 5 times a day, to weave prayer into the fabric of ordinary hours. I missed the sunrise once, and I cried, not from guilt, but from love, because now I knew what I had missed. Music was still part of me. I had feared that embracing Islam would mean abandoning it, that I would have to silence the part of myself that had always spoken through sound. But faith doesn't erase, it refines. It teaches you what deserves to be amplified. I began composing differently. No lyrics about ego or longing for the crowd, just whispers of gratitude, notes that moved like prayer beads sliding between fingers. Sometimes I'd play after Fajr, when the world was still half asleep and the sky was the color of mercy. The melodies felt like they didn't belong to me anymore. They belonged to the silence that had taught me how to listen. One afternoon, I met my old bandmates. We sat at the same cafe where we once planned tours and argued over set lists. They joked, they ordered their usual drinks, and when they asked why I wasn't having one, I told them I don't need to anymore. They laughed, not unkindly, just confused. Later, when the laughter faded, one of them asked quietly, "So, are you happy?" I smiled. One of them sighed, one of them sighed, in with my laughter, in quote, end quote, unquote. Not the kind of smile that performs, but the kind that lives. "I'm at peace," I said. He nodded. He didn't understand, but he respected it, and that was enough. That night, as I prayed Isha, I remembered all the nights I had stood before a crowd, eyes closed, hands trembling around a microphone, how I had begged music to fill a hole it was never meant to fill. Now, I stood before my Creator, no crowd, no spotlight, only truth, and I realized every note I'd ever played was just an echo of the call that had been reaching for me all along. Faith, I learned, isn't a finish line. It's a rhythm. It flows through joy and through struggle. There were days I faltered, moments when the discipline felt heavy, when the old life whispered softly from behind the curtain. But prayer was always the return, the gentle hand that pulled me back. One evening, months after my Shahada, I went back to the mosque alone. The same wooden door, the same quiet welcome. The Imam was there, reading. He looked up, smiled, and said, "You've grown calm." I laughed softly. "Or maybe I've stopped fighting the calm." He nodded, and in his silence, I heard understanding. After prayer, I stayed behind, sitting where the light touched the carpet. The world outside moved fast: cars, ambition, noise. But here, time had no pulse but the heart's. I thought of everything I had left behind and everything I had gained. They weren't opposites. They were the same story, written in two languages, one of sound and one of surrender. I whispered a small dua, "Ya Allah, if I ever lose this peace, teach me to find it in you again." And I knew he would. As I walked home, I passed a child playing a small drum by the roadside. The rhythm was imperfect, offbeat, joyful, human. I smiled, because now I understood every sound that reaches the heart is a kind of remembrance. And silence. Silence is simply the space where remembrance begins. That night, I took out my guitar for the first time in weeks. I didn't play to remember the past. I played to praise. A slow melody rose, wrapped in gratitude, and I ended it the way all prayers end, with peace. I whispered, "Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Peace and mercy be upon you." I set the guitar down. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full alive, listening, the kind of silence that only God can compose. And in that stillness, I finally understood why he had taken me through music to find him. Because only through sound could I learn the beauty of silence.